Okay, so the last video led to a whole lot of questions and discussion, and I think that's a fair point. I should probably offer a context, a framework of combat operations inside the U.S. sector of the Korean DMZ, as they were from '53 to 1991. And that will set up that context will set up the story, and I can explain some of the questions. Specifically, why didn't we shoot the North Korean infiltrators that were running away? So let's do that. Okay, nominally speaking, this is the U.S. sector. You'll see the bottom line down there called the DMZ, and that's the fence. The DMZ runs up to the next black line, running along the top and then cutting sharply to the south all the way on the left. And that's called the military demarcation line. Now, a DMZ is, nominally speaking, 2 kilometers wide and 151 meters long, meaning from that fence, the DMZ fence, to the military demarcation line, MDL, is about 2 kilometers at its widest length. Okay? Obviously, it gets much tighter than that in certain areas. And it runs 151 miles across the peninsula, but the U.S. sector is approximately 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers. And it centers here on a small, it's not truly a village, we call it the village of Panmunjom. Actually, that's supposed to be Panmunjom with an M at the end, my misspelling. You can see the military demarcation line. And then you'll see this little area called JSA, Joint Security Area. And that is the ROK and U.S. forces camp. And the little purple hash marks there indicates a village. And again, Panmunjom is not truly a village, but it is a lot of buildings and gardens. And it is it's a diplomatic negotiation area that is patrolled specifically by the JSA. That is, they don't truly do combat operations. Let's talk about them for a second while my camera sits here and shakes. But what they do is JSA is responsible for guarding, and it's a very dangerous area. But they have 1 platoon on guard, 1 platoon on QRF, literally guns up, sitting in trucks back at JSA in case there's an incident, and 1 platoon that is resting. So the JSA is essentially a big company, all right, of ROK and U.S. troops. And at least at the time I was there, they didn't really patrol outside. That patrol, that great big area, this area here, north of the DMZ fence, to the immediate south of us, on the lower left-hand side of the corner, that would be a ROK sector. And you can even see some of the ROK sector right there on the right-hand side of it. But for the most part, what you're seeing is white means open fields. Those are rice paddies cut up by rice paddy dikes. And green means wooded forest area. Purple hash marks is a village, all right? So the village of Taesangdong is right there, roughly center. All right, and this was the U.S. Area of responsibility for combat patrols. But we didn't stay in there for the most part. We stayed right down here, a couple miles away, at a large place called Warrior Base. And Warrior Base was attached to everything else by the Main Supply Route 1, MSR1. And Warrior Base housed an entire battalion at a time, okay, 600 to 800 men at a time. And so you know that a battalion has 3 companies. And so a company would... one company would be actually dispatched to be inside the DMZ. We'll talk about that in a minute. While the other one was doing preparation for it. And the third one was pulling actual guard shifts. So we'll talk about that. So you had a guard, if you want to call it that. You're really outpost. You weren't much of a guard at all. But you did have... guard surveillance, observation, some combat patrols, just local area patrols, and, minefield clearing, which was a constant hassle. Also reporting infiltrations and all this stuff. We'll get to it. But that's one thing you did. The other ones were actually doing combat patrols, daytime reconnaissance and presence patrols, and then nighttime ambush patrols. And then, like I said, the third one is you're actually preparing, which means you're really doing combat patrols there. That area right there by to the east of MSR, there's east, to the MSR1 and south of the DMZ. You did all of your preparation patrols there, and we actively guarded that area. Now, immediately north was the rock, one of the rock sections, and I haven't drawn it to great detail where their posts are or anything else. I'm not going to for security reasons, but nonetheless, that was due north, and so we actually backed the rock patrol for the preparations. But then when you go up there, you'll see, off to the west, here's the west. This was the U.S. Patrol. So if you were on quote-unquote guard post, you were at an outpost called Olet. There was a platoon up there. So there's one rifle company, and there's one of its platoons. It would be at Olet, okay? And that is a outpost, often referred to as guard post Olet. The other platoon would be down here in Collier. So there would be your next platoon. And the third platoon would, in fact, be all the way back here, sitting in Humvees or Mutts or, deuce and a half, whatever the case was, all ready to rock and roll. One platoon was always on QRF, Quick Reaction Force, and it could just go zoom right in past the gate. That's the main gate, which did have another guard unit there. Zip up there, and it could start aggressing and firing upon, take the enemy. Okay, so you have one company doing guard post duty, if you want to call it that, but again, it was outpost duty, surveillance of the bad guys. And they're at Collier and Olet. And then they have their QRF down at Warrior Base. The second company then would have platoons going in nonstop, right around 24 to 30-hour platoons doing reconnaissance patrols in the daytime and ambushes at night. That we would do what's called networked ambushes. That is a series of ambushes, 2 or 3 at a time. Okay, and that would be our area that, this is the area that we would do that. Okay, your third one then is preparing for the patrolling phase, and they're over here. They are north of Warrior Base, north of the MSR, and south of that DMZ, and so they're patrolling all back there. Yeah, they are combat patrols, but they're not inside the DMZ. They're just south of it. And just north of that, again, without much detail here, this is the rock sector, one of the rock sectors, and we backed them up. But in fact, and they did the same over here. They had rock patrols down here. You'll see pictures of this all the time, people walking the fence, and they still walk the fence to this very day. So they still do patrols south of the DMZ. But when we say 53 to 91, we're talking about inside the DMZ, and of course this was the U.S. sector. So that's your 3 rotations by company. All right, and if you look over here, you'll say this is the Dolphin Head area. Right over here, this is kind of, you can see like a bottlenose head coming out of the water. He's shooting right up, a little mouth open or something. That's called Dolphin Head, and it's just wide open, other than a few exceptions where you see the green trees, and that's very hilly in there. Well, parts of it are, and parts of it are very flat, but the rest of it is flat, wide open, rice paddies broken up by rice paddy dikes. This is Olet, and right here is Infiltration Alley. This is a very buttress slope, very steep sloped alley covered in dense woods, and the enemy would, the North Koreans would slip through here and ambush people down here, doing patrols or on MSR1. And there were multiple very deadly ambushes over the years down there. So that's Infiltration Alley, mostly wooded, much more hilly. Collier is up on a mountain, as is Olet, okay? So that's what you're doing. You're running around there. And people will say, hey, why didn't you guys have, ground radar and thermal and passive light systems? And the answer is, what are you talking about? We had all that. We had all that for years. We had very advanced stuff. But vegetation, particularly in the summer, often will appreciably defeat thermal. And that hilly terrain will defeat ground radar. And so they're just natural places where the enemy could slip by. Furthermore, this Taesongdong, which is actually Joseon-ri is the village name. A dong is a neighborhood. So Taesongdong is the neighborhood of Taesong. That's a farming village. You have to have lived there and been family. That's handed down since the Korean War. They're the only people allowed to live inside the DMZ. But this is an active area. What I'm saying is there's people literally farming this area. Now, they have a night curfew, so they go into their village and they don't come out. But the enemy often used that as shadow because, of course, you can't tell one human, warm body from another human warm body. And so they would come in there. And that's why, Dolphin Head was also a lot of hotbed activity. My story is this. When I was up in Collier, there are two bridges there. There's a bridge right just to the southwest of us, but there's one further away, and it's called 1,400 meter bridge because it is 1,400 meters from Collier. And so give you some scope there. And so one night I'm sitting there on the guard post in Collier. It's probably just past midnight. I'm in my bunker, and I get this really intense call on my landline. That is a TA1. And I'm talking to a 312 hooked up to a GR39, if you guys know what the Growl 39 is, and it allows the 77 to talk to the 68 to talk to me on my field phone. Very cool stuff. And I got a patrol down there. There's a 12-man ambush patrol in position down at 1400, and they are freaking out a bit because they're saying, we got 3 North Koreans moving in. And I'm saying, no, dude, you got 3 deer. And he's like, no, North Koreans, no deer. And he disagrees. And I said, look, I've got a buck with antlers and 2 doe walking in front of him coming down into your kill zone. You can open up, but you're only going to kill deer. And he's like, no, you're absolutely wrong. I said, tell you what, this is the patrol leader. I said, turn around towards Collier and wave at me. And so he waves at me. This is the middle of the night in the summer. And I said, okay, you're second from right in your ambush line, and you're holding an M203. And he says, wow, you can tell that. And I said, yeah, I can see you clearly. And I can count the points on that buck. And so he says, all right. And he let them walk through, and they didn't shoot him up. So it kind of just shows you we did have great coverage and great surveillance, but I mean, it was a mess. It was a mess, and it was a hotbed of activity. And so that's kind of what's going on here. You've got QRFs, you've got all this other stuff, you've got Warrior Base down there, and this is all the ongoing combat operations. So the question is, all right, well, the night in July 4th, 1986, there's my patrol base. That's where we were. And we decided to dispatch, after doing reconnaissance all day, we decided to dispatch 2 ambush. The first ambush would be just here south of Taesongdong, just off of that tree line out in the open. And you'd see, you have to orient. You have to be very careful. This is a populated area. You had to orient your ambush. And so they oriented their ambush into North Korea, trying to catch them in the open. And that's actually where they were compromised by a North Korean crawling out from Taesongdong. Okay, crawling out from that tree line where they just set up, where they had just traveled themselves. I'm pretty sure the North Koreans were following them in, back behind their patrol. So anyway, that's where they get compromised. That's where they kill the 1 North Korean. And in the meantime, I had left our patrol base on Walking Point, and I'm walking west. We delayed, we let ambush 1 set in first, give it about a half hour. Ambush 2 would leave the patrol base, and we'd go set in ours. Way up here, we were supposed to go where we actually met the enemy, right there. And then we were supposed to go due north, do a patch of the road, cross MSR1, and set up an ambush oriented that way, making sure we didn't take, JSA or Joseon-ri into fire. We're going to set up that way and catch the enemy out in the open again. Well, it never happened because as we moved west, we hit the enemy right there. And when people have asked me, well, good grief, why didn't you shoot? And, I was so scared. I remember putting a M203 in my tube, but the reality was that I wasn't ready. If I remember correctly, it's been 35 years. I wasn't going to launch a round. I was getting ready to, I actually leveled off my rifle. I was getting ready to shoot where I could kind of see the enemy coming through a bamboo thicket, and vaguely with my night vision, I thought, okay, well, they're going to come out here. And so I stood up on or knelt up, kind of propped my knee up on a rice paddy dike and took aim. And that's when my patrol leader, Staff Sergeant Rubio, he kind of grabbed my barrel real gently and said, no, don't. And so he kind of lowered my barrel, and I was like looking at him like, Rube, you've lost your mind. And he's like, I was thinking that too. Or he said something to that effect. And I was like, okay, he's considerate. So I went back down to, covered my chest, and we let him run on by. And here's why. Had I started shooting, and to be fair to myself, I was oriented northwest, so I think I was going to miss Joseon-ri. But had I started shooting when the enemy was between us, we all would have started shooting. the 2 enemy and the 12 men of our patrol would have just started lighting each other up at 40 meters. And look what the background was. That's right. It would have just gone right through those trees and started killing people in Taesongdong. So while at the time I admit, man, I really didn't understand why Rubio had done that, and it bothered me a bit. But once we were in the debrief the next morning, it was quite clear to me why he had said, no, don't shoot. He didn't want to kill civilians. So yeah, it was a good call. And then, that night is such a blur. You remember certain parts of the mission, but again, 35 years ago, and I probably haven't listened to Cyndi Lauper ever since. It probably traumatized me. But nonetheless, I think we never got into our ambush, if I remember correctly. We wound up somewhere up here doing a blocking mission because the QRF came in. Our other ambush patrol fell back to the patrol base. I think we wound up falling back to the patrol base eventually, that same night. And then we unasked the area the next morning shortly after sunrise, and then did a debriefing. But yeah, I mean, that's very quintessential of what goes on inside of the DMZ. I don't think that our story is really that amazing. You said, well, it was very likely one dead Korean. I'm like, yeah, North Korean. But again, I think most people that do a DMZ tour, a 90-day DMZ tour, have some kind of similar story, some kind of close call. And some of them are quite, much more deadly and much more casualties than that. But that's North Korean operations. That's a Korean DMZ operations in the U.S. sector. Your mileage may vary. This is 1986 I'm discussing. So if you were there in the 50s, 60s, 70s, or even the early 90s, it was probably a little different, but not fundamentally different. All right, cool. Thanks for listening.